Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 90 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, also known as the mighty OGGO. If you're watching at home on CPAC, I hope you will like and subscribe and give us a raving 5-star review. Pursuant to Standing Order 1064, the committee is meeting to resume consideration of a request for contracts between the federal government and electric vehicle battery manufacturing companies. Reminder, please do not put your earpieces next to the microphone as it causes feedback and potential injury. The meeting was adjourned yesterday. We're debating an amendment moved by Mr. Souza. We're resuming debate on the amendment from Mr. Souza. I'm starting a speaking list. I see Mr. Massey, I see Mr. Jouari, I see Mr. Souza, and Mr. Kusmirchuk, Mr. Genuis, and we will go. Not Mr. Generous, and we'll go from there. We have 2 hours right now. Mr. Massey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for a couple minutes of grace there. The House had some activity on C-27, so I was just getting a quick briefing on that. So thank you for a couple extra minutes to get here. It's appreciated. I want to respond, I think, to Mr. Jouari, who actually is a friend. So when he said that joke about not listening, don't other members be offended. He did that yesterday. There was related to a filibuster that I was doing at that time as the Liberals were trying to reduce my time in Industry Committee. So I spoke for over 2.5 hours, I think it was, on the bridge in Windsor. And so then Mr. Jouari did actually listen when others actually sometimes, I'm not sure if they did or not. So that was it was a kind pun that he was saying yesterday, not a negative thing in any respects. And he's always reminded me that I've well briefed him on the border between Windsor and Detroit. So I do appreciate that. But he did also ask about, an issue about this affecting my riding. And this is one of the reasons the motion as it is important for me to clarify that it restricts my capabilities in many ways to do my job and the interest that I have in the sector and also these investments. And I will say that there are investments. I mean, there's a lot of questions out there about the amount of jobs that are going to be created, and there's also a lot of questions about how they'll play out in the community. Is the lack of planning that's been done is scary, quite frankly. I think a lot of people will understand at this table the shortage of housing across Canada, and we have now to deal with, and there has been very little federal or provincial support provided to the municipality and also to the citizens over where some of these workers will come, whether they're going to be permanent or whether they're going to be temporary or maybe they'll be cycled in and out. There has been engagement with the private sector to some degree, and there has been city resources spent for that, but it's one that's going to create angst and anxiety and something we need to actually get publicly out there to continue to make sure the numbers are correct for proper social planning. Maybe with these opportunities, if there are going to be the contracts that we have to live with in the way that they're written, there's also a way of making sure that when this housing elements are done, they can maybe turn into social housing when the workers are gone. There's work that can be done in that vein that is important to maybe recover some of the concerns that are being expressed with the amount of capital investment that's being taken place and the fact that we have some workers that are going to end up having to come in regardless because the contracts are signed. So these are part of the reasons why I think shedding light on this issue is tremendously important. And I also want to have confidence that there's going to be the proper training provided. Again, we had all these time between then and now to work on getting more training done, and we haven't seen that take place. But perhaps with more light on this, there can be training opportunities for the future, whether they're for the plant in Windsor, which is coming online first, or perhaps some of the other communities sending some of their members to our area temporarily, or some of the Windsor members also going up to the different places to actually contribute and lessen the burden of foreign workers and the necessity of that in the future. But we don't have any of those things in place right now, and we don't know the answers to those important questions. And that's one of the reasons I can't agree with the amendment. And again, I think it's critically important is that, coming from an auto family, that the jobs are worth it, but we still don't have a national auto strategy. Something I've been after for a long time, and we have one-off deals that lead us vulnerable to these situations because we end up doing Hail Mary passes. And for those who aren't familiar with the football jargon, it's the last play of the half or the quarter where you throw the ball as far as you can and you hope that somebody catches it and then you can win or tie the game. And that's kind of our approach to some of these.
Excuse me, Mr. Massey, we have a point of order, and I think I know what it's going to be.
I feel obliged to point out that the origin of the phrase Hail Mary is not just sports. Thanks.
As a fourth-degree Knight of Columbus, I appreciate your intervention, Mr. Genuous. But I think we know what Mr. Massey was referring to. Go ahead, Mr. Massey.
Fair enough. And I welcome the intervention to set the record straight. But I guess, going back to the training elements of this is, I look at what we have in front of us now as an opportunity to try to improve what's going to take place in the subsequent investments. And I guess, I won't take up too much more time, but I do want to impress upon how important it is to me, to Mr. Jawahari, is because I've been on the picket lines. I don't know many people here, if everybody's been on so many times I've been on picket lines, whether it's for the Windsor Assembly plant, whether it's for the plant 2s and 3s, like the feeder tier plants, where they have even less rights and they have less supports. Local 195 with Emile Nabout and others, they do auto supply supports, and those workers, a tier 1 plant where my brother works, they often, are left a little bit farther behind than the assembly plants. And everything matters. Every dollar matters. Fighting for the benefits, the safety of the plants. It's in, I just came from a discussion in the halls of Parliament here discussing about the environmental conditions. My community has some of the highest cancer rates in the country. We have significant environmental degradation related to the work that was to building the manufacturing center for this country in the automotive sector. That's a legacy cost that we have that's in our water. It's in our land. I was on council when we did the first Brownsfields project, where a contaminated former Chrysler truck assembly plant was now a shopping mall. But it took massive, public incentives to do that, to recover it. So this touches us in every part and way. And as the auto sector has diminished, and this is important for these jobs in Windsor, so has our support to the United Way, because they don't have the same amount of fiscal capacity that they had before. So millions of dollars annually have been lost to the not-for-profit sector and other charitable organizations as we've witnessed plants modernizations and the more use of machinery and less human capital and labor and less jobs. And those have been hard collective agreements fought by the unions. And by the way, it's important to note that, the government's response in terms of the feds and the province, this comes on the backs of the negotiated agreements of Unifor to get investment in this country. Same with the other ones that have been done in the past. So this, to me, is very, very important, not only just with regards to a personal aspect, but also to a professional one. And also I want to mention a community one. And every opportunity that we can actually increase the employment capacity of Canadians to work on these elements and these places and through these deals, and the more we can shift that is worth it. If it's one job that was made fun of when I first raised it, that's okay. I can live with that. If it's hundreds or thousands of jobs later on in training, even better. But my job is to come here to fight for jobs. As things currently stand, I have a lot of concerns. So I'll conclude by saying I'm glad that my colleague raised this. And again, I'm happy to give him some more briefing on the Ambassador Bridge and how they want to actually bring toxic material now and hazardous waste, which actually is going to affect the auto industry as well too, and we're fighting that, and I'm getting a briefing to the minister today on that. But I can do that outside the halls of here, so we don't have to drag everybody else into that conversation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thanks, Mr. Massey. And I have as you are aware, I have a son at Windsor, and I appreciate your comments about the housing down there. Mr. Jawahari, I think then I have Mr. Sousa.
Yeah, thank you, and I'd like to once again thank my colleague, MP Massey, for his kind words. And I indeed learned a lot, as Indu was one of my very first committees. that I joined, I definitely learned for someone who had been there for long. So I really appreciate it. So where did we end up yesterday? Where we end up yesterday is that we talked about the fact that we are a willing partner, and we remain to be a willing partner in this thing because we think it's a success story. We talked about the fact that we are being extremely transparent, but we are balancing that transparency with making sure that we mitigate the risk of unintended consequences as a result of a full disclosure. And our options at the table, and I strongly recommend we look at it, is consider it and approve it, is for us to go through a two-stage process. Stage one is that we have unredacted contracts in front of us, in front of all of us, okay, for a whole week. I'm willing to sit here longer than a week. I'm willing to, I'm just talking on my behalf. I'm willing to forego and be here right after the House rises for Christmas to look at these, because I think it's a success story, and we are accountable to stakeholders to make sure that. However, to mitigate the risk of unintended consequences as a result of a full disclosure, what we are saying is we'll ask the company to redact a copy that redaction could be made public. Now, we also talked about making sure that we go through the integrity of the process. We also talked about various stakeholders that we are accountable. We talked about the fact, and I reiterate the fact, that the hiring plan submitted to the Government of Canada during the process of incentive negotiation clearly states that who we are hiring, for how long we're hiring, how we're housing them, etc. Now, before I go to the point that I wanted to raise last night, which I've been reflecting on since last night around what's the real reason that we are trying to do this and we are not accepting that kind of approach, which is a very balanced approach, mitigates the risk, allows us. I'll come to that. But before, I want to go back to MP Massey. MP Massey said that he believes that there is lack of planning. And I'd like to submit that I am led to believe, at least based on what I'm reading, and I'm hoping that once we have an opportunity to look at these unredacted in committee and in camera with the clerk presence, that we'll see there's a lot of planning is gone. At least I can quote the fact on the planning that which what I have been quoting since then, and I read it from a briefing that's been prepared, at least for me. LG Energy Solution has confirmed to sole investor officers that they still intend to hire 2,500 Canadians and have hired 130 since March, and continue to hire as per their hiring plan submitted to the Government of Canada during the process of incentive negotiation. So this tells me, at least on the labor side, there is definitely a plan. My colleague last night spent a lot of time talking about the IP. We talked about that. You talked about the report of training. It's clearly stating here that these, once again, this is clearly stated that these are temporary, special skill that they're coming to Canada and they're crossing border back and forth between Canada and U.S. to be able to implement as well as training. So once again, when my colleague MP Massey brought up proper training, I don't think that's something that's going to get redacted, whether under unredacted or whether the company redacted, because this is a success story. Nobody wants to hide the fact that we are bringing under international trade, free trade agreement we have with Korea, as well as the genesis of the contract. And also look at the unions. Unions are already been part of this. They've looked at it. I'm sure, you know, the head of unions has been in touch with you. So around proper training, at least it's quite clear here that why these resources are coming. So regardless whether we look at it in public or in camera, training is already part of it and it's being discussed. You also talked about the housing, and that's great. As you know, our government over the last since I would say, August, we've been going around and making announcement in various cities, working with all provinces, working with municipalities. I am proud to say that in Richmond Hill on Monday, I was along with Mr. Fraser, where we made an announcement of $31.2 million for housing accelerated funding. Those funding is also available to city of Windsor. And just as MP Macaulay said, my daughter is also a graduate of Windsor dual JD. And yes, housing was a big issue. And I'm glad. And this might be an opportunity for us to be able to make recommendations. And the recommendation that you're bringing, it's a great recommendation. But I don't think that's going to be something that's going to get redacted, that we are so worried about. If you're openly and publicly talking about it, that's great. So when we talk about lack of planning, I think there is a plan, at least on the labor side. I believe there is a plan on implementation of these technologies, because we are boarding 130 people to be able to do this. We are already issuing visa for these under the free trade agreement for these expertise to come to Canada. As far as proper training, it is naturally fit into the fact that these special resources are coming here, special skills are coming here. Housing is a great concept, and it's open for us to discuss. Now, you also talk, MP Massey also talked about national audit strategy. I think that's a great idea.
The bells are ringing.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, I see.
Order, I thought Mr. Badway was going to point out how irrelevant and repetitive his colleagues'
No,
comments were.
with all due respect, I don't
You
think
actually
it's
got wrong.
irrelevant, because my colleague brought up, my colleague
Yes,
MP
let me,
Brian Massey
let
brought
me
up all those
address
points,
the
and I'm
point of order,
addressing
Mr.
all of these
Jouari.
points.
Mr.
That is
Jouari.
regardless whether it's
Mr.
unredacted.
Shawari,
In-
please.
in fairness to the-
There was a point of order. We've got 28 minutes. Can we seek unanimous consent to go for 20 minutes, and then we'll break 10 minutes before vote?
Nope, denied.
Oh, that's sad. Okay.
Sorry, I'm deaf on this side. That's why I wear this. So I just wanted
Mr.
to let you know.
Before
I'm
we
not
go,
being
Mr.
disrespectful.
Jouari is just pointing out to everyone his hearing issue.
I'm blind on the right side, deaf on the left side, so this is why.
We are suspended till after the vote, folks. We have a hard stop at 1:30. We have 2 votes coming up, which is going to eat up all the time, so I am going to adjourn. Colleagues, thanks for your patience today.
Lunch was